In this video, we're going to unpack power and politics in organizations, what they are, how they work, why they're unavoidable, and how to navigate them ethically and effectively. You'll hear terms like power games or office politics used as if they're automatically bad. But in organizational behavior, we treat power and politics as normal features of organizational life, sometimes constructive, sometimes harmful, and always worth understanding. Let's start with a core definition. Power is a capacity that person A has to influence the behavior of person B, so that B acts in accordance with A's wishes. Notice two important things in that definition. First, power is potential. Power can exist even when it's not used. Someone might have the ability to influence outcomes and still choose not to exercise it. Second, power is deeply tied to dependence. The greater B's dependence on A, the greater A's power in the relationship. So the real question becomes, what creates dependence? Dependence depends on two things. One, how important the resource is that A controls. And two, how many alternatives B thinks they have. A simple line to remember is, a person has power over you only if they control something you desire. Quick example. Imagine you're working on a high-stakes project. Only one person in your department knows how to run the critical analysis that the board expects. If the deadline is close and you can't easily find another expert, you become dependent, and dependency creates power. Students often confuse power with leadership. They overlap, but they are not the same. Leaders use power as a means of attaining group goals. Leadership typically requires some level of goal congruence and shared direction between the leader and followers, but power does not require goal compatibility. Power only requires dependence. Another distinction. Leadership research often emphasizes style, transformational leadership, servant leadership, and so on. Power research focuses more on tactics, how people actually gain compliance and influence decisions. Also, power isn't only individual. Groups can exercise power, departments can exercise power, and coalitions can exercise power. Now let's look at the bases of power, formal and personal. A very practical framework divides power into formal power and personal power. The first base of power is formal power. It comes from your position in the organization. There are three types. 1. Coercive power. This is power based on fear of negative consequences, punishment, threats, embarrassment, unpleasant assignments, demotion, dismissal. 2. Reward power. This is the ability to distribute things others value: money, bonuses, promotions, recognition, preferred shifts, interesting assignments. 3. Legitimate power. This comes from your formal role in the hierarchy. People accept that your position has authority. So coercive, reward, and legitimate power are tied to organizational structure and mechanisms. The second base of power is personal power. It comes from who you are, not what position you hold. Two major types are: 1. Expert power, which is influence based on expertise, specialized skill, or knowledge. In modern organizations, as work becomes more specialized, expert power often increases. 2. Referent power is influence based on admiration, identification, and liking. If people want to be like you, or they value your approval, you have referent power. This is why charisma matters, and why celebrities influence behavior, even outside formal authority. Which bases are most effective? Research consistently suggests that personal power tends to be most effective. Expert and referent power are positively related to factors such as satisfaction with supervision, commitment, and performance. In contrast, reward and legitimate power often show weaker relationships with these outcomes, and coercive power frequently backfires. So if you're thinking like an OB scholar, you might say, formal power can produce compliance while personal power is more likely to produce commitment. Now let's go deeper into dependency, because it's the mechanism behind power. The dependency postulate is simple. The greater B's dependency on A, the greater A's power over B. So how do people or units create dependence? Three key factors. 1. Importance. The resource must matter. Organizations try to avoid uncertainty, so people who can reduce uncertainty, who absorb it, often become powerful. 2. Scarcity. A resource must be scarce to generate dependence. This is why in-demand occupations can negotiate higher pay and better conditions. 3. Non-substitutability. The fewer substitutes that exist, the more power the controller has. Put these together, and you get a useful influence question. What do I control that is important, scarce, and hard to substitute? That might be data, relationships, a skill, approval rights, timing, access, or even credibility. Having power is one thing. Using power effectively is another. Research identifies 9 influence tactics. I'll walk through them with quick examples. 1. Legitimacy. You rely on your authority or rules. You might hear something like, "For compliance reasons, we have to do it this way." 2. Rational persuasion. You use logic and evidence, such as, "Here's the data, here are the risks, here's why this is the best option." 3. Inspirational appeals. You tap values and purpose. For example, "This matters because it aligns with what we stand for." 4. Consultation. You involve others in how to do it, such as, "How should we implement this so it works for your team?" 5. Exchange. You trade favors or benefits. You might hear something like, "If you help me with this, I'll support your request next month." 6. Personal appeals. You ask based on loyalty or friendship, such as, "I'm asking you because I trust you." 7. Ingratiation. You use praise or friendly behavior first. For example, you might say, "You did a great job last quarter. Can I ask for your support on this?" 8. Pressure. You use threats or repeated demands. For example, you might say, "This has to be done by Friday. No excuses." 9. Coalitions. You enlist others to influence the target. For example, "Several teams are aligned on this. Can you join us?" Which tactics work best? In general, the softer tactics tend to be more effective and less costly. Rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, and consultation are often the most effective. Pressure tends to be the least effective and commonly backfires. A practical rule: start with softer tactics that draw on personal power. If they fail, escalate carefully to harder tactics. Also, combining tactics can help, as long as they fit together. Finally, direction matters. Rational persuasion has been found to be the only tactic that tends to be effective across organizational levels. Inspirational appeals work especially well downward with subordinates. Pressure, when it works, is generally downward. Coalitions and personal appeals can be especially effective laterally, peer to peer. Power doesn't operate in a cultural vacuum. People from individualistic cultures often see power in more personalized terms. Power as legitimate for advancing personal ends. People from collectivistic cultures often frame power more socially. Power as legitimate when it helps the group. That difference affects which tactics feel acceptable. Now add another layer: political skill. Political skill is the ability to influence others to enhance your objectives. Politically skilled people are typically more effective users of influence tactics, and political skill matters even more when the stakes are high. Organizational culture also shapes influence. Some organizations value consultation. Others value logic and analysis. Others rely heavily on pressure and hierarchy. And fit matters. People who fit the culture often become more influential, partly because they can perform well in what the culture rewards, meaning they're influential because they are perceived as competent. Now let's tackle the big question. Does power corrupt? Evidence suggests power can lead people to put their own interests ahead of others, react negatively to threats, and become overconfident. But it's not that simple. The effects depend on factors such as personality. For example, anxious personalities may be less likely to be corrupted by power because they don't assume that power benefits them. Further factors to consider include systems and accountability. One study found that power increased self-serving behavior, but when accountability was introduced, self-serving behavior stopped. Another factor is status dynamics. Those most likely to abuse power can be people who are low status and suddenly gain power, because low status can feel threatening, and fear can turn into misuse. And importantly, there are positive effects too. Power can energize people, motivate goal pursuit, and, when people have strong moral identities, enhance moral awareness. A memorable way to put this is, power doesn't always corrupt. Sometimes power reveals. Now we shift from power to politics. Political behavior is an activity that is not required as part of one's formal role, but that influences, or attempts to influence, the distribution of advantages and disadvantages within the organization. Key elements. It's outside formal job requirements. It influences goals, criteria, or decision processes, and it includes actions like withholding information, whistleblowing, spreading rumors, or leaking confidential information. Notice, politics can be ethical or unethical, but it is often informal, ambiguous, and difficult to regulate. Political behavior is shaped by both individual and organizational factors. From the perspective of individual factors, politics is more likely when people are high self-monitors and internally controlled, meaning they believe they can shape outcomes. Furthermore, it is more likely when people have a high need for power. For example, a Machiavellian personality is associated with comfort in using manipulation for self-interest. Also important, people's investment in the organization, perceived alternatives, and expectations of success shape whether they take political action, especially illegitimate action. Then there are organizational factors. Politics often has even more to do with the organization than the individual. Politics increases when resources decline or shift, promotions are available, trust is low, roles are ambiguous, performance evaluation is unclear, and rewards feel zero-sum. This is especially true if there is high pressure for performance and/or senior managers act self-servingly. Furthermore, downsizing and restructuring also trigger politics because people try to protect what they have. Research shows that for many people, especially those with modest political skill or low willingness to play, the outcomes are mostly negative. Perceptions of organizational politics are strongly linked to lower job satisfaction, more stress and anxiety, and higher turnover in tensions and quitting. So politics isn't just an abstract concept, it's experienced as psychological strain. When employees see politics as a threat, they may respond with defensive behaviors, reactive behaviors to avoid action, blame, or change. Let's group these. Avoiding action includes overconforming. The rules clearly state buck passing or shifting responsibility, playing dumb, pretending not to know, stretching, making a short task look long, and stalling, public support, private inaction. Then we have avoiding blame, which includes buffing, documenting everything to protect yourself, playing safe, only taking low-risk projects, justifying, explaining away responsibility, scapegoating, blaming external factors, and misrepresenting, distortion, embellishment, and selective presentation. And finally, avoiding change, which includes prevention, trying to stop threatening change, and self-protection, guarding information or resources. Defensive behaviors can feel protective in the short term, but in the long term, they reduce trust, damage relationships, and can become habitual until defensiveness becomes someone's default style. Another major concept in organizational politics is impression management. Impression management is the process by which individuals attempt to control the impressions others form of them. High self-monitors are especially likely to use impression management because they're skilled at reading situations and adjusting behavior. Impression management does not automatically mean fake. People can genuinely believe their excuses or claims, but misrepresentation is risky. If the claimed image is false and others discover it, you may be discredited. An interesting research detail. Self-promotion can help in interviews, but in performance evaluations, ingratiation tends to be positively related to ratings, while self-promotion can backfire. There's no perfect line separating ethical from unethical politicking. But here are two practical ethical questions to remember. First, utility versus harm. Ask, does the benefit of this political behavior outweigh the harm it may cause others? Flattering a supervisor is relatively low harm. Stealing credit is high harm. Second, equity and justice. Ask, does this conform to fairness? Inflating one employee's evaluation and deflating another's to justify unequal raises is unfair and unethical. And a warning, powerful people may become very good at justifying self-serving behavior as best for the organization. That's why people with strong power bases should be especially alert to ethical risk. We'll end with something practical, a political map. A political map helps you think clearly about your career and your dependencies. Ask yourself, what are your ambitions? Who has the power to help you get there? And what is your relationship with those people? Then sketch key decision makers, informal influencers, allies and opponents, who controls resources you need, and where you have expert or referent power. This isn't about manipulation. It's about reality. Because power and politics are part of organizational life. And choosing not to engage is still a choice, often a choice to be less effective. Better to see the system clearly and act ethically within it than pretend it doesn't exist.
As we end this discussion of power and politics, let's summarize. Power is the capacity to influence grounded in dependency. Power differs from leadership because leadership requires some goal alignment. Power comes from formal bases, coercive, reward, legitimate, and personal bases, expert and referent. Influence tactics range from rational persuasion to coalitions, and softer tactics tend to be more effective and less risky. Politics is informal influence over advantage and disadvantage, shaped heavily by organizational conditions. Politics can create stress and defensive behavior, and impression management plays a major role. Ethics matters, especially for those with power, and a political map can help you navigate power realities with clarity.
Thank you for joining me. I look forward to discussing further organizational behavior topics in further videos.